Hi, so today I am going to share with you my favorite politics-oriented, political science-oriented podcasts. So I don't listen to all of these every week, but I think I'll give you my top 10 different podcasts that correspond to politics. So here we go. So the first one, and I'm going to read the full descriptions off of my computer, which is right here. The first one, I listen to this one every day without fail, and it's the NPR Up First. So NPR Up First is usually about 10 to 12 minutes. It is hosted by Rachel Martin, David Green, and Steve Inskeep. And it's usually up by 6 o'clock in the morning, which is when I wake up, and it goes over the news of the day before and that morning so that I am prepared to go into my day knowing what's going on. So that's a good one. The other really good podcast from NPR is the NPR Politics Podcast, and that is going to be number 2. So number 2 on our list is also from NPR. It's the NPR Politics Podcast. This is a weekly roundup that political reporters produce about what went on that week. I don't always listen. If I've had a lot of NPR Up First or I've listened to these other podcasts, it might be a bit redundant, but if you're just starting with political podcasts, this is the place to go. Number 3 on our list is going to be a court-centered, constitutional law-centered podcast, and this is one of my favorites. It's produced by Roman Mars and Elizabeth Jaw, and Elizabeth is a constitutional law professor, and Roman Mars is kind of well known in the podcast community. He doesn't do constitutional law. The premise is that 5 minutes before class, Professor Joe checks Twitter and find out what the 45th President of the United States has said, and then marries that with what the constitutional law actually is. And a lot of this is whether or not he cannot or can engage in the activity that he's engaging in. So it's weekly, it's a basic con law class, and it's related to things happening in the United States today. So that's actually really educational if you're not a constitutional law scholar. Number 4 is Radiolab's More Perfect. And Radiolab More Perfect is now in its 2nd season, and it's about, the show says, how does an elite group of 9 people shape everything from marriage and money to safety and sex for an entire nation? So this is a spin-off series from a Radiolab podcast, and it goes in depth into the factual circumstances surrounding really famous Supreme Court cases and the precedents they set. So the last episode that they posted as of the time of this video is about gender equality and the Craig v. Boren case. And that case was argued by Ruth Bader Ginsburg and was one of her most significant marks on constitutional law and gender equality, and might have been an impetus to stage gender equality. These episodes are typically between 30 minutes to an hour, so this is a good one to listen to at the gym or on a commute or something like that, but I highly recommend. So number 5 on our list is another courts-oriented podcast, and this is First Mondays. First Mondays comes out on the first Monday of the month, and it's about the Supreme Court. It's hosted by Dan Epps and Ian Samuel, and is produced by Melody Rowell. And it's recorded each week that the court is in session. So it starts in the October term and goes through the spring, and they kind of give a preview of what cases are going to be argued this week. So it says Dan Epps is an associate professor of law at WashU in St. Louis, and Ian Samuel is a fellow and lecturer at Harvard who clerked for Scalia, and Epps clerked for Kennedy in 2009, so they have inside knowledge of the court as well as practical knowledge. And they have the academic chops to produce this podcast, and so it's actually very interesting if you're interested in going a bit deeper into what the court is doing in the modern term outside of More Perfect. Number 6 is The Weeds podcast from Vox. So The Weeds is semi-weekly, and these are typically about an hour long, and it's hosted by Ezra Klein, Sarah Cliff, and Matthew Iglesias. So this podcast is another bi-weekly roundup of what's going on, and as the title suggests, they go into the weeds of politics at the time. So one episode is the policy implications of the Harvey Weinstein scandal. So it's a really, really well done podcast. So coming in at number 5, the Weeds podcast from Vox. Now we're on to number 6, and this is Constitutional by the Washington Post. This podcast is also typically around 50 minutes to an hour, and it is a spin-off series after Presidential, and it goes into depth about constitutional moments in American history. So the tagline is Constitutional, a podcast about the story of America. So it says, with the writings of the Constitution in 1787, framers set out a young nation's highest ideals. We can talk about that another time. So we've been fighting over it, what it is, and what was left out. At the heart of these arguments is the story of America. So this is hosted by Lillian Cunningham, and she explores the Constitutions, the people who framed and reframed it, revolutionaries, abolitionists, suffragists, protesters, justices, presidents, and the ongoing structure to have a perfect union in the United States. So that's a good one. Once again, might be a bit basic if you study constitutional law on a daily basis, as I do, but incredibly, incredibly informative. The next one is an NPR podcast called 1A, and this podcast is hosted by Joshua Johnson, and is inspired by the First Amendment. It goes over the just different First Amendment issues: speech, religion, association, anything included in the First Amendment. And these episodes are shorter. They're about 35 minutes. Sometimes they can be long. They do a lot of more modern, how the First Amendment affects modern politics, so it's not a historical podcast, and so it's extremely interesting. I'd give it a listen. This is John Lovett's Love It or Leave It show, and he has different guests each week, but he's clearly left-leaning, so if that is something that you're concerned with, be aware of that. John Lovett is a former Obama speechwriter and co-host of Pod Save America, which is another great podcast, not included in this list, but honorable mention goes to Pod Save America. And he is joined by comedians, actors, journalists, and many, many renowned friends of the pod for a roundup of the week's top news. So this one is actually really funny, and the episodes are longer. Sometimes they can be between an hour to an hour and a half, and so I listen to this while I'm cleaning or doing other types of chores or driving or walking to class, that type of thing. Well worth a try, but that is John Lovett's Love It or Leave It. Number 8 is the Brookings Cafeteria podcast. So the Brookings Cafeteria podcast is about, as they say on their website, ideas and experts who have them, hosted by Fred Drews, and in 2015 was recognized as the best news and politics podcast by Academy of Podcasters Awards. Who knew that? So what this group does is they bring in somebody from their institution that is doing some type of research in a social science field. So they did one the other week about the environmental effect of anti-feminist policies in third world countries, and how when women are disenfranchised in third world countries, the environment and environmental policy also suffers, and how those two things are connected. And it was incredibly interesting. I will try my best to find it and link it below, because it was just great. And so Brookings Cafeteria, for those interested in social science, A+. So coming in at number 10 is Uncivil. And this is from Gimlet Media, and it is a history podcast about the Civil War. And I realized, as I started listening to this podcast, that I don't know that much about the Civil War besides I always learned more about the aftermath of what happened during this time period and not so much the lead up and wartime activities of the country and how that affects our constitutional development. So highly recommend Uncivil. Let me see if who hosts this one's a shorter podcast, typically 25 minutes. There's only 6 episodes right now, so you can get through this pretty quickly. Okay, it's hosted by journalist Jack Hitt. I feel like there's another host. Anyway, Uncivil by Gimlet. Anyway, thank you for tuning in today to my top 10 podcasts.
Rivers and roads, rivers till I reach you. Rivers and roads, rivers